Welcome to Shatter.
Help me reach 5,000 subscribers. Support the video with a like and leave your thoughts in the comments. She announced the breakup like news. Not a conversation. Not even a confession. Just an update, delivered between calendar notifications and a half-finished sentence about her next meeting. I remember the exact moment because nothing dramatic happened. No raised voices. No shaking hands. She stood in the kitchen, scrolling on her phone, saying that maybe it was time to rethink us, the way people rethink a subscription they barely use. Her tone was clean, professional, almost kind, as if she had rehearsed it with bullet points. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask why. I didn't defend anything. I just nodded, the way I do when a client explains a decision they made weeks ago and only now decided to inform me. Later that night, she sat on the couch with HBO Max running in the background, some series we'd already half-watched. Sound low, tension higher than the volume. She kept glancing at her phone, not at me. I could tell she expected something. An argument, disbelief, fear. A reaction that would confirm I was still emotionally invested. I wasn't. What she didn't know was that the breakup didn't start that evening. It started months earlier, in quieter rooms, in work trips that ran long, in meetings that didn't need both of them present. It started when my business partner learned how to speak to my wife without using words. When strategy blurred into influence. When numbers turned into leverage. She thought she was announcing an ending. What she was really doing was confirming a trend. The next morning, I woke up before her. No speech. No packing bags in a rush. Just silence and math. I stood in the kitchen, coffee untouched, looking at the fridge covered in Costco receipts and magnets from places we no longer talked about visiting. Evidence of a shared life that had already stopped functioning. She believed everything could be discussed, reframed, rebranded, that we could sit down later and figure it out. I didn't correct her, because while she was still thinking in conversations, I had already shifted to transactions. Access, exposure, risk. By the time she realized I wasn't asking questions, it was already too late to ask why. She thought this was the moment she took control. It was actually the moment I stopped participating. The first sign wasn't a message or a photo. It was a delay. I noticed it in the numbers before I noticed it in people. A forecast that came in polished but hollow. A projection that leaned optimistic without earning it. My partner, Ethan, had always been sharp, almost aggressive with assumptions. Now his work felt softened, padded for approval instead of pressure-tested. That kind of shift doesn't come from insight. It comes from influence. At home, nothing looked broken. The routine still existed, just without weight. The fridge refilled itself. The lights stayed on. Boxes from Costco kept appearing like evidence of normalcy, stacked neatly, as if consistency could replace honesty. My wife moved through the house with confidence, already acting like the decision had settled into place. She assumed I was processing, grieving maybe, preparing a speech. Instead, I started observing patterns. Late meetings that only happened when Ethan was in town. Travel schedules that aligned too cleanly. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room, not abruptly, just enough to register as intentional. They weren't hiding. They were assuming I wouldn't look. The confirmation came quietly, not from her phone, not from his calendar. From a shared client file Ethan edited without flagging. He adjusted risk tolerance based on personal context, not data. Context he shouldn't have had unless someone had given it to him. My weaknesses. My limits. The pressure points I never put in writing. That was the moment I understood the betrayal wasn't emotional first. It was strategic. She didn't fall for him. She aligned with him. That night, she mentioned Ethan casually, the way people do when they think a name has been normalized. She said he admired how she handled pressure, how she balanced me. I acknowledged it without reaction. Neutrality confuses people who expect defense. Later, when she turned on HBO Max and sank into the couch, I went into the office and opened our operating agreements. No anger. No rush. Just confirmation of clauses I'd helped draft years ago, back when trust was assumed and foresight was considered paranoia. I didn't confront either of them. Confrontation requires belief that the other side is still reachable. What I felt instead was clarity. They thought they were ahead of me because I hadn't spoken. What they didn't understand was that silence, in my world, usually means the decision has already been made. By the end of that week, I wasn't wondering if they were involved. I was calculating how long it would take before they realized I was no longer exposed. Evidence doesn't arrive like a revelation. It accumulates like dust, settling where no one thinks to wipe. I didn't dig through phones or follow anyone. I didn't need to. Their mistake was assuming betrayal requires secrecy. What it really requires is repetition. Patterns always surface when you stop reacting and start measuring. I began with access logs. Shared drives don't lie, even when people do. Files open late at night, reviewed twice, then closed without edits. Comments removed, not revised. Strategic notes softened, then rerouted. My language repackaged. My caution reframed as hesitation. My limits reintroduced as obstacles they could solve together. At home, she watched me the way people watch whether they can't control. Calm on the surface, waiting for signs. She stayed polite, almost gentle, as if kindness could keep me stationary, as if being agreeable would delay whatever she thought was coming. One afternoon, she said she was heading out to pick up supplies for the house. Routine tone, predictable timing. When she came back, there were bags from Home Depot by the door. Shelving, organizers, labels, tools for restructuring space. She talked about fresh starts without using the word ending. I helped her carry the boxes in. I even smiled. That night, I compared timestamps. Her errands overlapped perfectly with a block of time Ethan had blocked off for internal review. No agenda, no notes, just a private window that didn't exist on paper. The financial trail was cleaner than I expected. No shared accounts touched. No obvious transfers. They weren't careless. They were confident. That kind of confidence comes from believing you're protected. Protected by me. What neither of them realized was that my role in the firm wasn't just strategic. It was architectural. I had built contingencies into places they never looked because they didn't think they mattered. They thought value lived in visibility. I let them keep thinking that. Instead of confronting, I started adjusting exposure. Quietly, methodically, I reassigned oversight. Reduced my presence in decisions they were already influencing. Not to withdraw, but to isolate variables. To see what broke when I stopped stabilizing. Things always break faster than people expect. By the end of that week, the picture was complete. Not because I had proof of intimacy, but because I had proof of alignment. Shared incentives. Shared risk. Shared silence. She thought I was still deciding how I felt. I wasn't. I was deciding how clean the separation needed to be before they noticed the structure was no longer holding them up. I didn't disappear. I stayed visible enough to be misread. That was the advantage. In the office, my calendar still showed availability, but my involvement shifted. I delegated meetings I used to lead. I forwarded emails I would have answered myself. Not abruptly, just enough to create a vacuum they didn't notice right away. People assume absence announces itself. It doesn't. It arrives quietly, disguised as efficiency. At home, I became polite in a way that felt unfamiliar. No warmth. No tension. Just distance wrapped in courtesy. She mistook it for maturity. For acceptance. She even seemed relieved, like the hardest part was over and now we could transition into something healthy. She didn't understand that transitions only work when both sides are moving toward the same future. I started my mornings differently. No shared routines. No kitchen conversations. I'd leave early, stop at Dunkin', sit alone with my coffee, watching the city wake up without me in it. No messages. No planning. Just quiet repetition. It grounded me in something that didn't require explanation. The Tesla stayed in the garage at first. Then I started parking it elsewhere. Not hiding it. Just removing it from the frame she was used to. Small absences disrupt expectation faster than grand gestures ever could. She began asking neutral questions. Not emotional ones. Practical ones. Where I was going. When I'd be back. Whether I'd seen an email from Ethan. I answered all of them calmly. Honestly, even. Just without detail. That's when the panic started, though she didn't name it that way. People don't fear loss. They fear loss of access. One evening, she sat on the couch with HBO Max playing, the glow of the screen reflecting off her face. She looked comfortable. Too comfortable. Like someone who assumes the floor beneath them is solid because it's always been there. I went into the office and started preparing documents. Separation of interests. Redistribution of oversight. Clauses that had waited years for relevance. Nothing aggressive. Nothing that could be framed as revenge. Just exits executed cleanly. I didn't announce any of it. By the end of that week, she sensed the shift but couldn't explain it to herself. I was still there, still responsive, still calm. What she couldn't see was that I was no longer reachable. Not emotionally, not strategically. The disappearance wasn't physical. It was structural. And once that kind of absence settles in, no conversation can reverse it. The move against Ethan wasn't aggressive. It didn't need to be. Structures collapse fastest when you remove the piece everyone assumes is permanent. I began by stepping out of meetings that framed him as indispensable. Not publicly, quietly. I reassigned strategic reviews to committees instead of individuals. Shared accountability is a slow poison for people who thrive on private influence. He adjusted at first, confident, still smiling in calls, still speaking like someone who believed the center would hold. At home, my wife mistook my calm for detachment without consequence. She talked about future alignment and clean breaks, using the language of brand decks instead of marriages. She believed we were negotiating feelings. She didn't realize I had already shifted to governance. One afternoon, while she was out, I stopped by Home Depot. Nothing dramatic. Boxes, locks, filing cabinets, tools for separation, not defense. When I got back, I installed them without comment. Physical order creates psychological distance faster than silence ever does. Ethan started feeling the pressure before he understood its source. Client confidence dipped. Not dramatically, just enough to require explanation. Decisions he once pushed through now stalled. Questions he'd never had to answer before started landing on his desk. He assumed it was temporary. That was the mistake. I made my exit official on paper first. Reduced equity exposure. Rebalanced voting rights. Triggered clauses that looked dormant but weren't. All within the framework we'd agreed to years ago, back when he'd trusted my caution instead of resenting it. The first sign that she noticed something was wrong didn't come from me. It came from LinkedIn. She saw it before I mentioned anything. A role update. Not flashy. No announcement. Just a quiet shift in positioning that removed me from the visible center of the firm. Still involved. Still relevant. Just no longer accessible through the channels she understood. That's when she asked if everything was okay. I told her yes. And I meant it. Because by then, the risk wasn't emotional. It was operational. And I had already insulated myself from both of them. Ethan reached out a few days later. Casual tone. Checking in. Looking for reassurance I didn't know him anymore. I responded professionally. Briefly. Without leverage. Without warmth. The illusion they shared was that I would fight for what we built together. What they didn't see was that I had already extracted what mattered. The rest was just infrastructure learning how to stand without me. The social shift didn't announce itself. It never does. It moved like a draft through rooms she thought were sealed. At first, it was subtle. Invitations stopped coming directly to her and started looping through me instead. Not because I asked for it, but because people default to the person they trust when something feels unstable. She noticed it at a dinner she wasn't explicitly uninvited from. She just wasn't included. The message arrived incomplete, forwarded late, already decided. She laughed it off, said it was probably a scheduling thing. But patterns don't care about excuses. In the firm's wider circle, people started asking neutral questions. Not about the marriage. About alignment. About continuity. About who was responsible for what now. They weren't accusing anyone. They were recalibrating. That's what professionals do when they sense risk shifting. She felt it when conversations changed tone. Compliments turned generic. Praise lost specificity. The kind of admiration that depends on reflected authority fades quickly once the source goes quiet. One evening, she came home irritated, not angry. Confused. She opened her laptop on the kitchen counter, scrolled through LinkedIn again, as if the screen might correct itself if she looked long enough. It didn't. The distance was still there. Visible. Measured. I watched without commenting. At the same time, my own presence grew lighter. Not louder. I attended fewer events. Spoke less. When I did, people leaned in. Silence creates gravity when it's intentional. She started compensating. Posting more. Sharing updates that framed confidence without context. People reacted politely. The engagement stayed surface level. No depth. No pull. That's when she understood something had changed, even if she couldn't name it. One night, she sat on the couch with HBO Max running, the room lit by something that wasn't connection. She didn't watch. She waited. For me to fill the silence. For reassurance. For something familiar. I stayed in my office, reviewing notes I no longer needed to act on. The separation had moved beyond assets and titles. It was social now, structural. Others had adjusted without being told. The next day, she asked if people were upset with her. I said no. And that was true. They weren't upset. They were done orienting around her. By the end of the week, she realized the isolation wasn't coming from a confrontation or a scandal. It was coming from absence. From a quiet recalibration where no one needed to say anything out loud. She hadn't been pushed out. She had simply been left standing where the center used to be. And for the first time, she understood that whatever I had stepped away from, I had taken something essential with me. Her isolation didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with unanswered pauses. She stopped pretending things were normal, but she didn't know what to replace that with. The confidence she used to wear like a jacket no longer fit. It slipped off in small moments she couldn't edit or repost. A delayed reply. A meeting that ended early. A compliment that sounded recycled. At home, she moved carefully, as if the space itself had become conditional. She spoke softer, asked questions she never would have asked before. Not emotional ones. Directional ones. Where I was headed. Whether I'd be home later. If I was still planning to attend something we used to attend together. I answered politely. Consistently. Without invitation. She mistook proximity for presence. I was still there physically, still sleeping under the same roof, still moving through shared rooms. But I no longer filled space. I passed through it. In the mornings, I left early. No explanation. No notes. I stopped at Dunkin', sat in the car with my coffee, and watched people who didn't know me move through lives that didn't intersect with mine. It felt clean. Unobserved. For the first time in months, my day belonged entirely to me. She started staying up later. HBO Max ran in the background again, but this time it wasn't comfort. It was noise. Something to compete with the quiet I no longer interrupted. She didn't watch the screen. She watched the hallway, waiting for footsteps that never adjusted to her timing. Friends stopped being reliable. Not because they chose sides, but because uncertainty repels attention. No one wants to stand too close to something that feels unresolved. Invitations dried up. Conversations shortened. The effort she used to receive automatically now required initiation, and even then, it felt forced. She tried leaning into Ethan. More openly now. Less careful. But he was distracted. Pressured. His confidence had thinned. Whatever stability she thought she'd traded up to was already under strain. One evening, she stood in the doorway of my office longer than necessary. She didn't speak. Neither did I. The silence wasn't hostile. It was final, like a door that had already closed and no longer needed guarding. That's when she understood the shift wasn't social or romantic. It was existential. She wasn't losing me to someone else. She was losing access to the version of me that made her world feel anchored. And there was nothing left to negotiate, because the person she needed to negotiate with was already gone. The confrontation didn't come with accusations. It came with timing. She waited until the house was quiet, until there was no background noise to hide behind. No HBO Max. No phone scrolling. Just space. She stood across from me like someone preparing to negotiate a contract they hadn't read closely enough. She didn't ask if I was leaving. She asked if I was still in this. The question itself told me everything. She wasn't asking about marriage or trust or what we had been. She was asking about access. About whether the system she'd relied on was still operational. I told her I was handling things responsibly. That answer frustrated her more than anger would have. Responsibility doesn't invite debate. It closes it. She tried reframing. Talked about stress. About miscommunication. About how partnerships evolve. She spoke carefully, the way brand managers do when they know tone matters more than truth. She believed if she found the right language, she could stabilize the situation. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't destabilized. I had already processed the end. What she was experiencing now was just the delay. She mentioned Ethan. Not defensively. Casually. Testing the ground. Saying he'd been under pressure, that the firm needed alignment. That maybe we should all sit down and reset expectations. I listened without interrupting. Then I told her there was nothing left to reset. No raised voice. No final speech. Just a statement of fact. That was the moment her composure slipped. Not dramatically. Just enough. Her breathing changed. Her posture shifted. She asked what I meant. I told her I had already stepped away from anything that required consensus between us. personally and professionally. That whatever she was trying to preserve no longer depended on my participation. She asked when I decided this. I didn't answer, because the truth wouldn't have helped her. The truth was that the decision had formed slowly, then all at once, like pressure reaching a point where structure no longer matters. She looked at me like I'd replaced myself with someone else. Someone colder, more distant, harder to reach. She asked if there was someone else. There wasn't. And that answer confused her most of all. By the end of the conversation, she understood something irreversible had happened. Not because I said it was over, but because I didn't ask for anything back. I wasn't negotiating terms. I was informing her that the transaction had already closed. Her collapse didn't look like chaos. It looked like stillness that had nowhere to go. The first thing she lost wasn't reputation or relationships. It was certainty, the quiet belief that she understood the order of things. That belief had carried her through rooms, through negotiations, through people who mistook confidence for depth. When it cracked, everything else followed. Ethan's situation deteriorated faster than she expected. Clients hesitated. Decisions stalled. The authority he'd borrowed stopped circulating once my presence was no longer implied. Pressure exposed habits he'd never needed to justify before. She watched him shift from charismatic to reactive, from composed to defensive. Whatever future she thought she was stepping into was already shrinking. At home, the space felt unfamiliar. Not empty. Unclaimed. She moved through it like a guest overstaying. I didn't rush her. I didn't push timelines. I had already extracted myself from urgency. That left her alone with consequences that didn't respond to persuasion. She spent evenings on the couch again, HBO Max filling the room with dialogue that didn't require participation. She let episodes play without watching. The screen gave her something predictable when nothing else was. The stories resolved themselves. Hers didn't. Friends stopped checking in. Not out of cruelty. Out of uncertainty. People pull away when they don't know where to stand. And without my gravity anchoring her, she had become difficult to place. She began remembering things she'd ignored before. The way I used to anticipate problems before they appeared. The way I absorbed pressure without broadcasting it. The way stability had followed me without needing explanation. At the time, it felt invisible. Now it echoed. She tried reaching me emotionally, not with words, but with presence. Sitting closer, lingering longer, waiting for me to notice. I noticed. I simply didn't respond. One night, she stood alone in the kitchen, staring at nothing. The kind of stillness that arrives after all strategies fail. She wasn't angry. She wasn't pleading. She was finally honest with herself. I was already living differently. Not dramatically. Not visibly. Just without reference to her. That was the real collapse. Not losing me, but realizing I had stopped being a factor in her decisions long before she understood what that meant. By the time she fully grasped it, there was nothing left to argue with. Only the silence she could no longer manage. The end didn't arrive as a decision. It arrived as alignment. By the time everything settled, there was nothing left to announce. No dramatic exit. No speech that would make sense out of what had already happened. The separation had completed itself while she was still trying to understand which conversation might reverse it. I finalized the last documents quietly. No deadlines pushed. No pressure applied. Clean signatures. Clean transitions. The kind of ending that doesn't create stories because it doesn't leave loose ends. At home, she moved differently now. Slower. More deliberate. As if each step required permission from a space that no longer belonged to her. She wasn't hostile. She wasn't pleading. She was careful, which told me she finally understood the stakes had changed. One morning, I left early like I always did. Stopped for coffee, sat alone, watching the city wake up without noticing me. Dunkin' cups all look the same when you're no longer sharing them. The ritual wasn't about comfort anymore. It was about closure. When I came back later that day, she was waiting. Not positioned. Not rehearsed. Just present in a way that didn't ask for leverage. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She acknowledged, finally, that she had mistaken access for permanence. I listened. That was all. She asked if there was any version of us left. I told her there might be a future, but not a continuation, not a return. Anything forward would exist on terms that didn't require me to disappear inside it. No shared illusions. No borrowed authority. No quiet compromises dressed up as loyalty. She nodded, not because she agreed, but but because she understood there was nothing left to negotiate. That night, she sat on the couch again with HBO Max playing softly, the sound low enough to feel optional. I packed what was mine. Not everything, just what I needed. The rest had already lost relevance. I didn't rush. I didn't look back. At the door, I paused long enough for the moment to register. Not for her. For myself. I didn't vanish. I simply stopped showing up where respect had become conditional. And for the first time in a long time, the silence felt earned. What would you have done in my place? If the story hit you, leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe. It only gets stronger from here.